Hi, I'm Amanda McKay. I'm a professional artist and I'm making these videos to give you simple tips to help enhance your creativity. For this video, I'm going to be talking about the fatigue that occurs sometimes if you're working on your creative practice for a long stretch of time and how to overcome this and what to do about it. So if you are lucky enough that you can set aside several hours or maybe even a whole day to work on your art or your hobby or whatever, then that is really fortunate that you're able to have that much time. Maybe you have like a Saturday or something and you're wanting to just work on your art or your hobby, and it's very tempting to try to make the most of this time and just keep going. And especially if you feel like you're in the flow or you're just on a roll somehow, you just want to keep going and not stop. And especially if you've had to bring together a bunch of people, like maybe you're in a recording studio and you've had to bring in all the other musicians, or maybe you're a filmmaker and then you've really had to coordinate a lot of people, not just the crew but the cast as well. So obviously in those situations you're going to be trying to make the most of your time that you have, and that's very understandable. But then the problem is you can start to become really fatigued from working for such a long stretch of time. And I'm not just talking about physical fatigue. That is a part of it often. For me as an oil painter, I will, after a few hours, unfortunately, I'll start to have soreness and even pain in my rotator cuff and my back just from working for so long. But even beyond that, there's mental fatigue, specifically decision fatigue. Even if you're not doing anything creative, just as you go through the day, apparently people make on average 35 decisions a day, which is just insane. But supposedly as the day goes on and we're having to make more and more of these decisions, our brains will just get tired out and we run into decision fatigue. And so in addition to just your daily, your day-to-day decisions that you have to make, if you're doing something creative, then if you're having to make decisions about what you're working on, as the hours drag on, you might start to make worse and worse decisions. For example, if you're in a recording studio, you have to make a decision after each take. Was that take good enough? Did I like that? And then, was the sound right? Did I like the guitar tone? That kind of thing. And so these can start to, as you're just going on and on all day, you might start to be making what you would essentially consider some mistakes. And then there's also sensory fatigue. And this would be just your eyes or your ears or whatever will get tired. If you're in the recording studio, for example, your ears can actually just start to feel tired, and like you can't even really hear stuff the way you could when you first got in there. And then for me as a painter, I will often, especially if I'm painting something that's a bright color, I will start to see what I think people call a color negative superimposed on what I'm painting. And basically you're seeing the inverse of the color. So if you've probably had this experience at some point where maybe you look at an object that's brightly colored for a few seconds, and then if you look away, like on a white wall, for example, you would see the kind of the shape of the object that you were just looking at, but it would be sort of the opposite or the inverse color. So for me, if I'm painting something like a bright red leaf and I'm looking at it, it will start to, if I were to look away at a white wall, it would show the leaf in like a blue or greenish color instead of red. And the problem is if I'm painting and I'm looking at that leaf while I'm painting it, and then I've got basically another color superimposed over it, I'm no longer accurately seeing what I'm painting because it's having a dulling effect by having sort of the opposite color on top of that red. So what I'm looking at isn't really what is. If I'm not careful, I can wind up with the red just way too bright as my eyes are trying to overcompensate for that. And of course, I try to look away every so often to kind of rest my eyes, but it gets harder and harder to do as I'm painting for many, many hours. So we end up with physical fatigue, mental fatigue, and sensory fatigue. And so, but of course, we don't want to stop working if we're on a roll. What's the solution? Well, there is a pretty easy solution, and it's probably pretty obvious. But the solution is that you have to take a break and you come back with fresh eyes or fresh ears or whatever. But preferably you would go overnight. So whatever you've done in the studio or whatever I've painted, at some point, you know, you're going to finish for the day or finish for the night, and then you come back, at least wait overnight. And maybe if you're able, if you can wait a couple days, that might be even better. But try to come back first thing in the morning, or well, maybe not first thing in the morning, but early in the day, before you've just had to make a bunch of decisions just in your day-to-day life, and run into decision fatigue, and come back and look at what you did or listen to what you did, whatever, and just see if there are any mistakes or anything that you would do differently. And hopefully you won't find anything, especially if you've been doing, you know, if you're not a real beginner and you've been doing whatever you're working on for a while and you're more experienced, hopefully you would have figured out at this point kind of how to overcompensate, or how to compensate for the different deficits that you would have as the day goes on. But just take a look, at least overnight, and come back with fresh eyes or fresh ears or whatever, and see if you like what you were working on. Now this also can work if you're just you're coming up with ideas. If you're generating ideas like you're brainstorming, you know, maybe you've worked at that for an hour and then you feel like you're all out of ideas for now. And so, okay, so you would have to come back to it later. So the same thing applies, where can you come back and just look at your ideas with fresh eyes, and waiting at least till the next day, and maybe if you can, even a few days. And I've talked in earlier videos about the importance of writing down your ideas or recording them in some way so that you don't forget. And that makes this much easier. But then you can come back a few days later and you can just look over what the ideas were that you came up with. And hopefully they'll still look pretty good. Unfortunately, every so often I have an idea and I think it's great, and then I come back and look at it with fresh eyes and a fresh brain, and then I think like, okay, this was not the great idea that I thought it was. But also, if you come back and you're just looking at these ideas and reviewing them, often because your mind has had a little bit of a rest, often you can come up with some different ideas just kind of based on whatever you had from the day or a couple days before that maybe you didn't have at the time because you were just getting kind of worn out. So this can be extremely helpful, like I said, just in the brainstorming phase, or again, if you've actually been physically creating something. Either way, coming back with fresh eyes or fresh ears at least the next day, I think you'll find this extremely helpful. So I hope you like this video. Again, my name is Manda McKay, and thank you so much for watching.